lovelies, and welcome back to Seriously Now. I'm Lex Carline, and I hope you're having a wonderful week so far. And for those of you in Wales, like me, happy back to school. Now, I love my little munchkin more than anything, but trying to keep up with her when your body doesn't always work like it's supposed to, cheers fibromyalgia, can be exhausting. So thank God for school. Now, today's tale is one of blood, sex, and torture. So now your ears are pricked, let's dive in, shall we? The Blood Countess, Elizabeth Bathory, sometimes referred to as Elizabeth, or Countess Dracula, was said to drink and bathe in the virgin blood of her victims to give her eternal youth. Nice. Her victim count was said to be around 600, which earned her the title of the most prolific female serial killer in history, and even a posthumous Guinness World Record, which might not be entirely accurate, but we'll get into that in a bit. She has inspired films, operas, TV shows, and even video games, with Lady Gaga's character the Countess in American Horror Story said to be modelled on Bathory. But was she really a maniacal murderer, or was she actually the victim of an elaborate plot to seize her assets? Born Countess Elizabeth Bathory de Exed on the 7th of August 1560 in Hungary, so warning, I may well butcher a lot of these names, but I'm going to do my best, to parents Baron George VI and Baroness Anna Bathory. She only had one sibling, an older brother named Stephen. The Bathorys were part of a wealthy dynasty that controlled Transylvania, which is now in Romania. Europe's moved around quite a lot over time. Not literally. So her uncle Andrew Bonaventure Bathory, which is a brilliant name, was the voivode, or local governor or ruler, thanks Google, of Transylvania. She was also the niece of Stephen Bathory, which I wonder if that's where her brother got his name from, and he was King of Poland, the Grand Duke of Lithuania, and Prince of Transylvania. They were quite a well-to-do bunch. Sadly, her upbringing was tainted by ill health, and by the age of just 5, she had epileptic seizures, violent mood swings, and painful migraines. Which, even with today's modern medicine, wouldn't be fun, which didn't have any of that, so no matter what she turned into, I think we can agree, poor kid. And given the time that she was growing up, she was exposed to brutality from a young age, and apparently at the age of 6 was when she saw her first public execution. My daughter's about to turn 5. Oh, that just boggles my mind. Also, given the era that she was in, she would have been witness to servant beatings as well, which was perfectly normal and legal for the time. By the time Bathory was 13, although some sources say as young as 11, she was engaged to 18-year-old Count Ferenc Nadasdy. Now I'm going to call him Ferenc because I feel much more confident saying that one. Ferenc's family were another prominent Hungarian family, of course, because the rich only marry the rich, don't they? At the time of her engagement, Bathory was said to be a beautiful and well-educated girl, so she wasn't stupid. However, before Bathory married Ferenc, and during their engagement, legend has it that she gave birth to a baby boy by a lower order, or peasant man. Such were the things at the time that Ferenc was said to have her lover castrated and torn apart by dogs. Wonderful. The child was what they called hidden from view, and I've taken this to mean adopted, all because they were born as a bastard out of wedlock. The couple were married when Bathory was just 15 years old, and Ferenc was 20, on May the 8th, 1575. Obviously we are in the old enough to bleed, old enough to breed, old enough to be married off era. Really glad I wasn't born then. Their wedding took place in front of approximately 4,500 guests, so just a small affair. The couple went on to have 5 children together, so taking Bathory's total to 6, with the first being born 10 years after they married, which was probably quite late by the standards of the day. Their children were called Anna, Orsolya, Catalin, Andras, and Pal. Unfortunately, Catalin and Andras died as infants, which was common for the time, and that's why people often had large families. Anna would grow up to marry Croatian Count Nicholas Zrinski VI, Orsolya would marry Istvan Benyo II, and Pal fathered Ferenc Nadasdy II, who was a central figure during the Austro-Turkish War of 1663 to 1664. Once married, the couple moved to Western Hungary and lived in Ferenc's family castles, Savar in Hungary and Szeged, which is in present-day Slovakia. Ferenc was said to be the one who schooled his wife in torture, even gifting her a pair of spiked gloves to thrash her servants with if they misbehaved, which was perfectly legal, as I've said. Could you imagine? Oh, you've misbehaved, I'm just going to offer you with a pair of gloves with spikes on. It is said that just for Bathory's pleasure alone, Ferenc had a girl restrained, presumably a servant, lathered in honey, and then had her ravaged by bugs, which is sick. Creative, on a Saw franchise kind of level, but sick. In fact, in 1602, Lutheran priest Istvan Magyari actually wrote a letter to the courts openly discussing the excessive cruelty that Bathory and Ferenc subjected their servants to. Now remember, servants had no rights, they were basically slaves. So for somebody to have taken note of how people were treating their servants, must have been pretty bad, because most of them were at it. And had he been paid attention to, potentially could have saved lots of other young women. Ferenc was a soldier, and he was often away, fighting off Ottoman Turks. In fact, they actually spent most of their marriage apart, which is probably why it went so well. And whilst her husband was away, Bathory would run their estates, and rumour has it, take various lovers. They were married for 29 years before he died on the 4th of January 1604. In the years leading up to Ferenc's death, he had actually suffered from a disease of the lower limbs. Couldn't find any information on what it was specifically, possibly arthritis of some kind. But he succumbed to a sudden and mysterious illness in the middle of a battle. And that was it for Ferenc. Some say that Bathory's Aunt Clara further corrupted the woman by introducing her to orgies and a shadowy circle of sorcerers, witches, and alchemists. Kind of wish I had an aunt like that, actually. Maybe not so much the orgies. I am definitely a one at a time, not sharing thanks. But sorcerers, witches, and alchemists, sign me up. So after Ferenc passed, naturally Bathory took full control of the estates, which she'd been running anyway, so it probably didn't make much difference to her, and especially as he was often away. Not much changed, I imagine. She did move to Countess Castle in western Slovakia the same year, and it was then that her despicable ways were said to reach their peak. Now, bearing in mind her husband was quite often away, so why things ramped up supposedly after his death, I don't know. But that's how the story goes. And it didn't take long for the stories of the alleged depravity to tumble down the hill into the town of Countess. Oh, the jungle drum whispers were big back in the day, just as they are now. Don't think that'll ever change. Elizabeth Bathory was accused of a litany of crimes against her female servants, and eventually even minor noblewomen who had come to her for training and education. It was said that she continued to use the honey and bugs torture that her late husband had introduced her to. She also enjoyed various other methods of torture. Imagine that. Roar this next bit. During colder parts of the year, Bathory would force young women to strip and take deadly ice baths. She sometimes forced needles into their fingers, cut their lips and noses, whipped them with stinging nettles, and she'd even bite their shoulders and breasts, burn the flesh, including genitals, because, we're not missing anything out here. And that would possibly suggest a twisted sexual motive as well, but it's impossible to know for sure, because it's not like we can dig her up and ask her, "Yo, Bathory, what'd you really do this for?" It was often said that Bathory liked to bathe in the blood of her virgin victims to keep herself young. Now, how do you discover that bathing in virgin blood keeps you young? Where does that come from? Well, in this case, she supposedly discovered the obscure beauty method after she slapped a female servant so hard that she cut her face open. The blood splashed onto Bathory's face, and it said that she thought when she wiped away the blood that her skin looked magically younger. Of course it did, love. Although historians have claimed that this story could have been exaggerated to include this, as many just couldn't believe that a woman could be capable of this level of violence just for violence sake. Well, how wrong they would be. I'm not just meaning Elizabeth Bathory. We know now that there are women out there who are just as capable of violence for violence sake as men. It's not gender specific. It's just shitty people. By 1609, rumours had begun circulating and gaining traction that Bathory was killing not only the servant girls, but young noblewomen as well. Now remember, like I said, the servants had little to no rights back in these days, and killing them whilst seen as very gauche wasn't illegal for a noble. Perks of being rich. But killing nobles, even those of a lower rank than yourself, creates a problem that can't be ignored, and this would be Bathory's undoing. In 1610, an investigation began into dozens of disappearances and suspicious deaths in Countess, launched by King Matthias II of Hungary. On December the 29th, 1610, Count Georgi Thurzo, who oversaw judicial matters as Lord Palatine of Hungary, arrived at Bathory's castle to investigate the Countess's alleged crimes against her fellow nobles. They really didn't care about the servants. Thurzo reportedly saw Bathory tormenting a victim and as such imprisoned her immediately in her home. I mean, really? You'd have to be pretty stupid, knowing you're under investigation, to keep abusing with the investigator in the building? Okay. But as she was a noble, she received special privileges, such as being able to remain in her home and not be treated like a common criminal. It is well known that at that time, nobles would marry relatives to keep their status. So it's highly possible that her family's inbreeding, lovely, left her vulnerable to mental instability, which is a really nice way to put it, and her many other health problems. Because we know you shouldn't mix the close gene pools, it doesn't work. As well as being the Lord Palatine of Hungary, Thurzo was also Bathory's cousin. Conflict of interests, methinks? But at the time of her arrest on the 30th of December 1610, Happy New Year, Bathory's crimes were said to be confirmed by the presence of mutilated, dying or dead victims. Now we know she initially, allegedly, targeted the servant girls, said to be aged between 10 and 14, from the local villages. She lured them to her castle by the promise of work as a servant or maid. This is where it gets... She was accused of killing between a few dozen and over 600. The highest says 650, which is just a bit of a discrepancy. And in my opinion, if we're saying that she hadn't really killed many before her husband died and she moved to Countess, and then she suddenly ramped it up, that's a hell of a lot of people to suddenly go missing. I know the servants had no rights. I know they didn't really care about them, the authorities. Families would have done. If there really were 600 or 500, let's say she killed 100 before, I don't care how low-ranking servants were. That's a hell of a number, and the majority of them would have been servants, I imagine. It just, someone's fibbing a little bit, methinks. So there were witnesses, as there always are, who said that they had relatives who died whilst at Bathory's castle, and some even claimed that abductions had taken place. Bathory was arrested alongside 4 of her servants, 3 of whom were female and 1 male, just in case you were wondering. The servants were not subjected to the same noble perks as Bathory, and as well as being questioned, they were also tortured. Yeah, because that's a reliable confession then, isn't it? Whilst waiting for the trials to begin, Thurzo continued to investigate and collected 289 witness statements, with one stating that Bathory had herself listed the total of victims as 650. This number varied in other statements, and to this day the actual total remains unknown. The problem with the majority of witness statements was that they contained hearsay or no real information at all, so it just sounds like a royal waste of time. The servants' trials began in January 1611, and it didn't take long. And unsurprisingly, all 4 denied murder. However, they did accept culpability for burying multiple victims, although accounts varied as to whether it was 36 or 51. Either way, far less than 600. Although the fact that they were tortured means their confessions should have been deemed unreliable. People are going to say anything under that sort of distress, aren't they, really? The servants said they generally buried the victims at night in other church graveyards. Kind of clever and sneaky. Obviously the 4 blamed each other and Countess Bathory, but they also implicated Darvulia. Now, Darvulia was a deceased maid and governess of Bathory's. So could there have been an element of truth in it, or were they just trying to pass the buck on to someone they know couldn't defend themselves or be proved otherwise, because it's easy to blame the dead, isn't it? 3 of the 4 servants were sentenced to death, and they were executed quickly. The 4th servant, who was one of the women, was spared an immediate execution, but what happened afterwards is unfortunately unknown. We could speculate as to why. Maybe she was pregnant, maybe she agreed to give further information, but it would be purely speculation. A 4th woman was also arrested, and that took the total of alleged accomplices to 5. She had supposedly used magic to help Bathory, and so she was also executed. Now, as I've already said, the highest number of victims speculated was 650, and this was by a court official who was said to have seen the figure in one of Bathory's private books. Although the witness statement taken from Thurzo was from a servant girl the official had spoken to. But, funnily enough, the book was never materialised, and the official didn't testify, probably because Bathory herself was never tried. Yeah, another perk of the rich. Although, to be fair, this was despite King Matthias's wishes. He wanted her to go on trial. But Thurzo managed to convince him that putting Bathory on trial would damage the nobility. Oh, and we wouldn't want that now, would we? Can we think about anything like that still happening today? No, not at all. Okay. The trial and execution would cause a public scandal. Oh, no. And as such, the disgrace of a prominent and influential ruling family in Transylvania. Couldn't have that, could we? So basically, although he had a job to do, Thurzo still managed to save his cousin from the gallows. I mean, she might not have hung, per se, but you get what I mean? So with no trial, that also meant that Bathory was never convicted. And obviously Ferenc couldn't be tried from the grave, so if they really were guilty, they basically got away with it. With no conviction, it also meant that after she died, her assets would pass to her family, rather than being seized. Another perk of the nobility. At least they don't have that as perks today. Oh, wait. Elizabeth Bathory lived out the remainder of her days in her castle. Sources say she was isolated and walled into a certain section, which is still a damn sight better than prison, especially prison in those days. Couldn't have a noblewoman sharing a bucket in a corner, could we? On the 21st of August, 1614, aged 54, which wasn't too bad for the time, wasn't too good, Bathory's guard found her deceased in her room. She was lying face down on the floor, and she had actually complained of not feeling well the night before, but thought she could sleep it off. Initially she was buried in the crypt on the estate of Countess Castle, but due to the uproar of the locals, her body was moved. Possibly to her birthplace of Exed, but no one knows definitively where her final resting place is. Now there is speculation that Bathory was actually the victim of an elaborate plot by fellow family members and the Habsburg dynasty, who were another prominent family, with some even going as far as calling her a defenceless widow, though she didn't really sound like it. The Habsburgs at the time ruled a swathe of Europe, including Austria and Western Hungary. King Matthias was a Habsburg. And her family, well, yes, at one point Bathory had actually imprisoned one of her daughters for taking valuables from her property. A little bit extreme, maybe. And obviously, her sons-in-law were eager to get their hands on their inheritance without waiting for her to die. Such lovely fellows. So her being in prison would obviously help those close to her, but also her rivals. Because King Matthias was said to owe Bathory a substantial amount of money, which he didn't want to pay, and so naturally he would benefit from her demise. He was also said to have viewed her as a political threat, fearing she may support her cousin Gabriel Bathory, Prince of Transylvania, in his efforts to challenge Matthias's control of Western Hungary. Couldn't have that, could you, Matthias? The political landscape of the time was overrun with major rivalries, and it was not uncommon to accuse a wealthy widow of murder, witchcraft, or sexual misconduct, and Bathory has all 3, just to seize their land. Bastards. So it's quite easy to see how a conspiracy against her is highly plausible. What do you think? After her death, Bathory's castle remained uninhabited by nobility for another 100 years. Didn't get their hands on it that quickly then. Nowadays, you can have guided tours of the site. See the Elizabeth Bathory, Cruelty Hidden in Lace exhibit in the Drakovich Mansion in Countess. There's even a wooden statue of her in the town square. And I believe there are various other exhibits around Hungary dedicated to the Bathorys, not just Elizabeth, but the rest of her family as well. And whilst the tale of Elizabeth Bathory haunted the town of Countess for generations, it didn't gain wider notoriety until around 1744, when it was retold in lurid detail by Jesuit priest Laszlo Toroczy in a book on Hungarian history. This timing tied in with the vampire stories scaring Europe, and as such was said to have led to Bathory's infamy. We love a good vampire story, don't we, even today? It's even said that the iconic novel Dracula by Bram Stoker was said to be inspired, in part, by Elizabeth Bathory, and also Vlad the Impaler. Even though the two were separated by more than a century, they had a common reputation for cruelty, brutality, and bloodthirstiness across Eastern Europe. And so as it turned out, shock horror, the virgin blood baths did nothing to preserve Bathory's youth, although, with the publishings of witness accounts in 1817, it pointed to them being more fiction than fact, unfortunately. But it does allow her to live on in infamy. And so that brings us to the end of the tale of the Blood Countess. Did you enjoy it? Would you like to hear more like this? Let me know. As always, you can find me on the socials at Seriously Now Pod. And for your content ideas, feedback, and Seriously You stories, it's seriouslynowpod@gmail.com. So until next time, lovelies, stay safe, stay free, and stay weird. Bye-bye.